What if I told you the greatest fortune in state history wasn't buried by pirates but sealed behind rotting plaster in a house nobody wanted? This is the unbelievable true story of a desperate couple, a corrupted town, and a $1 bill that bought a multi-million-dollar secret. The gavel fell with a hollow, resounding crack that echoed through the damp, drafty halls of the Ashbridge County Courthouse. For a moment the room was so silent you could hear the rain lashing against the frosted glass of the tall, arched windows. Arthur Caldwell stood frozen in the third row, his calloused hands gripping a crumpled singular $1 bill. Next to him, his wife, Josephine, let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the wooden pew. "Sold," auctioneer Samuel Croft announced, his voice lacking its usual theatrical boom, replaced instead by a tone of bewildered pity. "Sold to Mr. Arthur Caldwell for the sum of $1. May God have mercy on your bank account, son." A low murmur rippled through the crowd of locals. It wasn't a murmur of awe, it was a chorus of mockery and disbelief. Arthur had just purchased 402 Maple Street, notoriously known to the town as the Montgomery Estate. To the untrained eye, Arthur had secured the bargain of the century. But to the residents of Ashbridge, Pennsylvania, Arthur had just signed his own financial death warrant. The Montgomery Estate was a colossal, decaying Victorian monstrosity that had sat abandoned since 1982. It wasn't just the black mold creeping up the grand staircase, the caved-in slate roof, or the fact that the floorboards were spongy with rot. The real trap was the back taxes and the city liens attached to the deed. By buying the property for $1, Arthur had legally assumed over $140,000 in municipal debts and demolition mandates. If the house wasn't brought up to code within 6 months, the city would seize Arthur and Josephine's primary assets, which, at this point, consisted of a rusty Ford pickup truck and a failing carpentry business. From the back of the room, a sharp, cruel laugh cut through the murmurs. Harrison Cole, the town's wealthiest real estate developer, stepped out from the shadows of the doorway. Cole was a man who wore expensive tailored suits that looked absurd in the dying steel town of Ashbridge. He had been quietly waiting for the city to condemn the property entirely so he could sweep the land for pennies and bulldoze it for a strip mall. "You're a fool, Caldwell," Cole sneered, adjusting his silk tie as he walked down the aisle toward the couple. "You think you're going to fix up that death trap with a hammer and a box of nails? That house is a grave. Elias Montgomery died a crazy, broke hermit, and his house is going to make you exactly the same." "It's got good bones, Harrison," Arthur replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the cold sweat pooling at the base of his neck. "And it's none of your business anymore." Cole stopped inches from Arthur. The scent of expensive cologne mixed nauseatingly with the courthouse's smell of old paper and floor wax. "I give you a month before you're begging me to take it off your hands. And when you do, I won't be paying $1. You'll be paying me to tear it down." That evening, the reality of their purchase set in. Arthur and Josephine drove out to Maple Street under the cover of a bruised twilight sky. The house loomed at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by overgrown weeping willows that looked like jagged claws scraping against the siding. The wraparound porch sagged heavily to the left, and the front door was boarded up with thick, weathered plywood. Prying the boards off with a crowbar, Arthur felt the first genuine pang of regret. When the door finally creaked open, the smell of damp earth, rat droppings, and decades of stagnant air hit them like a physical blow. Josephine clicked on a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam piercing the gloom. The interior was a disaster. Peeling wallpaper hung like dead skin from the walls. Debris from the collapsed ceiling littered the grand foyer. It was a monument to decay, Elias Montgomery, the previous owner, had been the heir to a massive textile fortune in the 1920s. But when the Great Depression hit, the family supposedly lost everything. Elias lived out the rest of his life as a paranoid recluse, boarding up windows, firing shotguns at trespassers, and eventually dying alone in the master bedroom upstairs. "Arthur," Josephine whispered, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand as it illuminated a massive crack running down the load-bearing wall of the living room. "What have we done?" "We trusted the math," Arthur said, though his voice lacked conviction. "If we can stabilize the foundation and clear the liens, the land below is worth a fortune. We just had to survive the winter." But survival in the Montgomery house was about to become far more complicated than fixing cracked plaster and replacing rotted wood. The house held onto its secrets tightly, and Elias Montgomery had not been nearly as destitute as the town of Ashbridge believed. The first 3 weeks were a grueling descent into physical and mental exhaustion. Arthur and Josephine practically lived at the estate, breathing through heavy respirators as they shoveled out decades of accumulated trash, animal carcasses, and rotting furniture. The winter air was unforgiving, biting through the uninsulated walls and turning their breath to thick clouds of steam. Despite the back-breaking labor, Arthur felt a strange connection to the house. As a master carpenter, beneath the grime and decay, he could see the incredible craftsmanship of the 1890s. The hand-carved mahogany banisters, the intricate crown molding, the solid oak pocket doors. There was a ghost of undeniable magnificence lingering in the shadows. But there was also something deeply unsettling about the house's layout. It started on a Tuesday afternoon in late November. Arthur was attempting to draw up a modernized floor plan for the city inspector to stave off the looming demolition order. He started with the formal dining room, running his laser measuring tape from the eastern wall to the western wall. 22 feet. He walked out into the hallway, went around to the adjacent library, and measured the shed wall back to the exterior frame. He did the math 3 times. He checked the original city blueprints he had pulled from the archives. "Josie," Arthur called out, his voice echoing off the bare hardwood floors. Josephine appeared from the kitchen, her face smudged with soot from trying to clear the chimney flue. "Look at this." He pointed to his sketch diagram. "The dining room is 22 feet wide. The library on the other side is 16 feet wide. The total width of the house from the outside wall to wall is 44 feet. Josephine stared at the paper, her brow furrowing. "Okay. 22 plus 16 is 38. That leaves 6 feet. Hallway?" "There is no hallway between the dining room and the library," Arthur said, a cold chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. "They share a wall, but the exterior dimensions dictate there should be 6 feet of space between them. 6 feet of space that just doesn't exist." Josephine looked at the heavy oak-paneled walls separating the 2 rooms. "A mistake in the city's blueprints. The house is over a century old, Arthur." Maybe," Arthur muttered, knocking his knuckles against the thick oak paneling. It sounded solid, completely solid. But Elias Montgomery was paranoid. He fired architects, brought in private contractors from out of state. The records are a mess. The mystery of the missing space might have been pushed aside in favor of urgent roof repairs, had it not been for the events of the following night. Arthur and Josephine were sleeping on an air mattress in the only dry room on the 2nd floor. Around 2 a.m., a heavy, rhythmic thudding jolted Arthur awake. It wasn't the settling of old wood or the wind. It was the distinct sound of a sledgehammer striking a wall on the ground floor. Arthur grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from his tool bag and crept silently down the grand staircase, his heart hammering against his ribs. The moonlight filtering through the broken windows cast long, distorted shadows. The sound was coming from the dining room, As he rounded the corner, he saw the silhouettes of two large men wearing ski masks. One was holding a high-powered flashlight, illuminating the very wall Arthur had been knocking on earlier that day. The other man was swinging a heavy sledgehammer, smashing it into the antique oak paneling. Wood splintered and cracked loudly in the silent house. "Hey!" Arthur roared, stepping into the room and raising the crowbar. The men froze. The one with the flashlight cursed loudly, dropping the light. Without a second's hesitation, the man with the sledgehammer swung it wildly toward Arthur's head. Arthur ducked, the heavy steel head smashing into the doorframe just inches from his skull. Before Arthur could recover, the two men bolted toward the back of the house, crashing through the kitchen and escaping out the shattered back door into the freezing night. Josephine rushed downstairs a moment later, clutching her fur and calling the police. By the time Sheriff Miller arrived, the intruders were long gone. The sheriff, a weary man who looked like he'd seen enough of the Montgomery house to last a lifetime, took their statement with a distinct lack of urgency. "Kids, probably," Miller grunted, shining his light on the smashed oak paneling. "Looking for copper piping, or maybe they heard the old ghost stories. People used to say Elias Montgomery hid his fortune in the walls before he died. Nonsense, of course. The bank tore this place apart in the 80s looking for assets." After the sheriff left, Arthur and Josephine sat in the freezing dining room, staring at the jagged hole the intruders had left in the beautiful woodwork. "They weren't kids looking for copper," Arthur said quietly. "They came with a sledgehammer, and they went straight for this specific wall. The wall with the missing 6 feet. Arthur." Josephine started, her voice laced with warning. "We don't have time for a treasure hunt. The city inspector is coming in 10 days. If we don't have the foundation reinforced—" "Josie, look at the hole," Arthur interrupted, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. He walked over to the splintered wood and shined the beam inside. Behind the shattered oak paneling, there wasn't a standard lath and plaster. There was a secondary wall made entirely of thick, industrial-grade cinder block, and wedged tightly between the cinder blocks was a layer of what looked like lead lining. "Elias Montgomery didn't build this to hold up the ceiling," Arthur said, a manic energy suddenly gripping him. "He built a vault." The next morning, abandoning all scheduled renovations, Arthur took up a heavy sledgehammer of his own. For 6 hours he battered the cinder block wall. The work was agonizing. The blocks had been reinforced with steel rebar, completely overkill for a residential home. Josephine helped clear the heavy debris, coughing through the dust as Arthur methodically broke through the barrier. It was mid-afternoon when the sledgehammer finally punched all the way through, biting into empty air with a hollow echo. Arthur dropped the hammer, his hands blistered and bleeding. He grabbed his crowbar and pried away the remaining chunks of block and mortar. The dust slowly began to settle, revealing the dark void of the hidden 6-foot space. Josephine handed him the heavy-duty flashlight. Arthur clicked it on and stepped through the jagged hole in the wall into a space that hadn't seen the light of day in over 40 years. It was a narrow, windowless corridor stretching the entire length of the 22-foot dining room. But it wasn't empty. Lining the back wall were dozens of heavy wooden crates, stamped with faded insignias that Arthur didn't immediately recognize. On top of the crate sat a massive, antique Mosler safe, its combination dial gleaming dully in the flashlight beam. But what made Arthur drop the flashlight, the heavy metal casing clattering loudly against the concrete floor, was what was stacked next to the safe. Carefully wrapped in oilcloth and thick leather bindings were hundreds of perfectly preserved, banded stacks of paper. Arthur didn't need to pick one up to know what they were. The unmistakable size and shape of currency. Arthur slowly picked up the flashlight and reached out with a trembling hand, pulling back the corner of the nearest oilcloth. He expected to see moldy, worthless paper, perhaps old Confederate money or worthless bonds. Instead, staring back at him was the stern, intricate portrait of Alexander Hamilton. But it wasn't a standard bill. It was bright yellow. A $1,000 gold certificate, series of 1928, in pristine, uncirculated condition. And there were thousands of them. "Josie," Arthur choked out, unable to tear his eyes away. "Come in here." As Josephine stepped into the hidden room, a sudden, sharp noise echoed from the front of the house. It wasn't the wind, it was the distinct sound of the heavy front door creaking open, followed by the heavy thud of expensive leather shoes, stepping onto the hardwood of the foyer. Caldwell. Harrison Cole's voice called out, smooth, confident, and dangerously close. "I saw your truck. I came to make you one final offer." Arthur and Josephine froze in the hidden vault, surrounded by millions of dollars in forgotten treasure as the footsteps began moving slowly toward the dining room. Arthur's thumb immediately slammed down on the flashlight's power button, plunging the hidden vault into pitch blackness. He reached out in the dark, his calloused hand finding Josephine's trembling shoulder. He gave her a firm, silent squeeze. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." Slowly, Arthur stepped back through the jagged hole he had smashed in the cinder-block wall. He wiped the plaster dust from his jeans and stepped into the center of the ruined dining room, just as Harrison Cole's silhouette filled the arched doorway. Cole stopped, his eyes adjusting to the dim moonlight filtering through the shattered windows. He saw the sledgehammer, the debris, and finally, the gaping black hole in the oak paneling. A slow, predatory smile spread across the developer's face. "Well, well, Caldwell," Cole murmured, stepping into the room. The two massive men in ski masks from the night before flanked him, stepping out of the shadows of the hallway. This time, they weren't carrying sledgehammers. They had heavy, matte black handguns resting loosely at their sides. "I told you Elias Montgomery died a crazy, broke hermit. I never said he didn't hide anything before he lost his mind." "You're trespassing, Harrison," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low, keeping himself positioned squarely between Cole and the hole in the wall. "I'm reclaiming family property," Cole countered, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He walked toward Arthur, a terrifying calm in his demeanor. "You see, Arthur, the town history books got it wrong. Elias didn't lose his textile fortune in the Great Depression. He liquidated it. He turned every last factory, every last share, into high-denomination gold certificates." Cole stopped a few feet away, gesturing toward the hole. "But in 1934, the federal government passed the Gold Reserve Act. It became illegal for private citizens to hoard gold or gold certificates. Elias had to surrender his wealth to the Federal Reserve or face federal prison. But he couldn't bear to part with it, so he turned to his banker for help to launder it, the vice president of the First National Bank of Pennsylvania. "Your grandfather," Arthur stated, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping together. "Jonathan Cole," Harrison nodded, a glint of twisted pride in his eyes. "My grandfather helped Elias hide over $4 million in untraceable high-yield certificates. In exchange, Jonathan was supposed to get a 30% cut. But Elias went paranoid. He built this vault in secret, locked the money away, and threatened to expose my grandfather to the Treasury Department if he ever came looking for his share." Cole pulled a crisp white envelope from his inner jacket pocket. "My family has waited 3 generations for this house to rot. We made sure the city slapped it with liens. We made sure it was condemned. And then you showed up with a dollar bill and ruined the timeline." Cole tossed the envelope at Arthur's feet. "There's $50,000 in cash in there. You take it, you walk out the front door, and you forget you ever saw this house. All my associates here bury you under the foundation, and I bulldoze this place tomorrow morning. Your choice." Behind the wall, Arthur could hear the faint, ragged sound of Josephine breathing. He knew the $1,000 bills stacked behind him were worth tens of millions of dollars to modern collectors. But they were also federal evidence of a generational crime. Arthur looked down at the envelope, then back up at Cole. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen. "You're not a very smart man, Harrison," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the dead house. "You brought guns to a real estate dispute, and you just confessed to conspiracy and the hoarding of stolen federal currency." Cole laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Who are you going to tell, Colwell?" "Sheriff Miller. He's been on my payroll since 2018. The city council, I fund their campaigns. I own Ashbridge." "I know you do," Arthur replied, a fierce, defiant grin breaking across his dust-covered face. "That's why I didn't call the sheriff." Before Cole could react, the deafening wail of sirens shattered the night. But it wasn't the single lazy siren of a local Ashbridge cruiser. It was a chorus of them. Red and blue lights exploded through the weeping willows outside, painting the walls of the dining room in frantic, strobing colors. "Josie didn't just find the money, Harrison," Arthur said over the rising noise. "She found the vault's ventilation shaft half an hour ago. While I was breaking the wall, she was outside, calling the Philadelphia field office of the FBI. We didn't report a break-in. We reported a violation of the Gold Reserve Act and the location of stolen federal assets." Cole's face drained of color. He whipped his head toward the front door as the sound of heavy boots hitting the porch echoed through the house. "You idiot," Cole hissed, genuine panic leaking into his voice. "The Treasury will seize it all. You get nothing." "I bought this house for $1, Arthur said, stepping aside as heavily armed federal agents burst through the front doors. "I've got nothing to lose. But you, Harrison, you got everything to lose." The Ashbridge County Courthouse was packed far beyond its fire code capacity. It had been exactly 3 months since the raid on the Montgomery estate, and the air in the room was thick with tension, buzzing with the whispers of reporters, federal prosecutors, and the stunned citizens of Ashbridge. The gavel fell with a sharp, commanding crack. Judge Thomas Sterling peered over his reading glasses, glaring down at the defense table. Harrison Cole sat there looking significantly older than he had 3 months ago. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, his usual arrogance replaced by the hollow stare of a man whose empire had just collapsed around him. "The court recognizes the evidence presented by the Department of the Treasury," Judge Sterling announced, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the room where Arthur and Josephine sat, holding hands. The aftermath of that night had been a whirlwind of federal investigations. The FBI hadn't just found the $4.2 million in pristine 1998 gold certificates in the vault. When federal locksmiths finally cracked the antique Mosler safe, they didn't find more money. They found Elias Montgomery's handwritten ledgers. Elias, in his extreme paranoia, had meticulously documented every bribe, every threat, and every illegal wire transfer Jonathan Cole had executed to help him hide the money. But it went deeper. The ledger contained the account numbers of offshore trusts that the Cole family had been using for decades to funnel their corrupt real estate earnings out of Ashbridge. Harrison's attempt to claim the money that night had activated a domino effect by admitting his family's connection to the hidden vault in front of Arthur, who had recorded the entire conversation on his phone. Cole had given the FBI the probable cause they needed to audit his entire development company. The corruption ran through the mayor's office, the city council, and Sheriff Miller, who had already accepted a plea deal. "Mr. Cole," the judge continued, his tone devoid of any sympathy, "the arrogance required to attempt to extort the legal owners of the Montgomery estate while simultaneously laying claim to stolen federal assets is staggering. Your family's stranglehold on this county ends today." The judge slammed the gavel down one final time, denying Cole's bail and remanding him into federal custody on charges of extortion, armed trespassing, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The sound of handcuffs clicking around Harrison Cole's wrists was the sweetest sound Arthur had ever heard. As the courtroom cleared, Special Agent Thomas Reed of the Treasury Department approached Arthur and Josephine. He was a tall, stoic man who had become a strange sort of guardian angel to the couple over the past few months. "It's officially over," Agent Reed said, shaking Arthur's hand. "The local liens on the property were tied to fraudulent assessments ordered by Cole. The state has expunged them. The house is yours, free and clear." "And the certificates?" Josephine asked, her voice quiet but hopeful. "As you know, the 1928 gold certificates are still technically legal tender, though their collector value is astronomical," Reed explained with a rare smile. "Because you did not attempt to fence them and actively reported stolen federal property, the United States government is claiming the face value of the currency. However, under the False Claims Act and federal whistleblower statutes, you are entitled to a percentage of the recovered assets as a finder's fee." Agent Reed handed Arthur a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the seal of the Department of the Treasury. The appraisal of the historical collector value of the notes came in at nearly $32 million. "Your recovery percentage minus taxes has been wired to your new accounts." Arthur's hands shook as he opened the envelope. He pulled out the official federal disbursement notice. He stared at the number, his breath catching in his throat. It was enough to restore the Montgomery estate 10 times over. It was enough to never worry about a failing carpentry business again. It was a completely new life. 6 months later, the Montgomery estate was unrecognizable. The rotting, weeping willows had been pruned, letting bright sunlight wash over the freshly painted Victorian siding. The sagging porch was structurally sound, wrapping elegantly around the restored home. Inside, the missing 6 feet of space had been opened up, creating a beautiful, sunlit corridor that connected the dining room to the library, erasing the dark history of the vault forever. Arthur stood on the front steps, holding a framed piece of paper. It wasn't a check, and it wasn't a newspaper clipping about Harrison Cole's 20-year prison sentence. It was the crumpled, singular $1 bill he had used at the county auction, perfectly preserved behind glass. A stark reminder that sometimes the greatest value isn't found in what something costs, but in the courage it takes to look past the decay, swing the hammer, and uncover the truth hidden in the walls. The story of Arthur and Josephine proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden right behind the walls of our biggest risks. What would you do if you found millions hidden in your home? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this incredible true crime mystery, don't forget to smash that like button. Share this video with a friend and subscribe for more mind-blowing historical secrets.